All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our event with Robert Rotberg and John Campbell for Robert's book, Things Come Together, Africans Achieving Greatness in the 21st Century. We're so thankful for you to be here. My name is Emma. I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books in Belmont, Massachusetts. A few things before we start the event. We've got a few events coming up. Not a lot because next week is Christmas, which is insane. So tomorrow we have New York Times bestseller Lev Grossman here talking about his new middle grade book, The Silver Arrow. And then on Thursday, we have Carol Hay in conversation with Shelby Delvin for Think Like a Feminist by Carol. And a few housekeeping things. If you have any questions at all, we have a little Q&A button down on the bottom of your screen. You should see it. You can just type in a question there. We also have a chat, which you can also add comments. I'll be in the chat as well, and I'll come back towards the end so we can do a Q&A portion. But if you ever have any questions, you can leave them in the chat or the Q&A function. Okay, and so now a little bit about our panelists. So Robert I. Rotberg is President Emeritus, I am so bad at reading, of the World Peace Foundation and founding director of Harvard Kennedy School's program on intrastate conflict. He was professor of political science and history at MIT, academic vice president of Tufts University, and president of Lafayette College. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has published a number of books and an article on Africa, Asia, Latin America, and writes extensively for American, Canadian, and overseas newspapers. He has lived and worked extensively throughout Africa. And so about John Campbell, John is the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He's the author of the upcoming book, Nigeria and the Nation State, Rethinking Diplomacy and with the Post-Colonial World, set for publication in December of 2020, and writes the blog Africa in Transition. From 1975 to 2007, Campbell served as a U.S. Department of State Foreign Service officer. He served twice in Nigeria as political counselor from 1988 to 1990, and as ambassador from 2004 to 2007. Campbell's additional overseas postings include Lyon, Paris, Geneva, and Pretoria. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Resources, Dean of Foreign Service Institute's School of Language Studies, and Director of the Office of UN Political Affairs. And so without further ado, I will give the conversation over to John and Robert. Take it away.
Thank you very much. It seems to me, the day after the Electoral College has met and voted, that this is a particularly opportune time to focus on Africa. I think based on demography alone, Africa will become much more important on the world stage in the future than it has been in the past. But I also think that we Americans do not pay enough attention to Africa, enough attention that would be commensurate with our own national interests. Bob, most of the headlines are about security issues, but it seems to me that the real sleeper issues in Africa and our relations with Africa are climate change, the African demographic boom, and the emergence of new diseases as population pressure results in the destruction of the rainforest. Yet Nigeria, which has 1 out of roughly every 5 sub-Saharan Africans, has no population policy at all. The military government tried to install one, failed, and essentially gave up. Under these circumstances, do we face the threat of a Malthusian crisis in Africa? In other words, where the number of people outgrows the food resources?
That's a very important question, John. Before I start answering it, I want to thank Belmont Books for hosting us and thank John Campbell for agreeing to uh, be the interviewer for this discussion of things come together, my new book. And I'm pleased that we're talking about Africa at a time when, as John says, Africa will become more important because the Nigeria is not alone in having no population policy, despite the fact that Africa is exploding. Africa now has 1.3 billion people. It will soon, that is in 20 years, have 2.6 billion people. And by the end of the century, according to the UN Population Division, it will have approximately 3.7 billion people. And that means that only India and China will be larger than Nigeria, the country about which John has written this magnificent book that you should all go out and buy. Now, the and Nigeria is constantly in the news. Kidnapping that John wrote about today, which happened yesterday. So yes, population explosion is critical. Not only will Nigeria become the third largest country in the world, larger than the United States, which will Nigeria is supposed to end up at the end of the century at 730 million. The US in fourth place will only have 420 or 30 million people. But that's startling enough. But the fifth largest country in the world by the end of the century was supposed to be Tanzania. Now, Tanzania only has 65 to 75 million people today, but because it is so poor and because girls are not being educated in secondary school, it means that their fertility levels are extraordinarily high. And so Tanzania, poverty and lack of girls' education means that Tanzania will boom to the point where it is well over 200 million people by the end of the century, and about half that by the middle of the century. Now those are startling statistics and numbers. The next countries on the list of population will be Pakistan and Indonesia. And then in seventh place is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, at the moment, Kinshasa, capital of the Congo, and Lagos, capital of Nigeria, or the commercial capital of Nigeria, are pushing 20 million people.
That's right.
No one really knows how many people live there. But that means that in these large cities in Africa, as big as Cairo, as big as Sao Paulo, as big as Mexico City and Manila, the problems that all these big cities have of traffic chaos and so on, in Africa compound because there's, with population growing out of bounds, there's no sanitation to speak of, and B, no available water or water easily available. Electricity is short, mostly full of, in the Congo at least, full of blackouts. Even in Johannesburg, we have that. So it's going to be very difficult for Africa to cope with the population explosion. and whether, and it could be Malthusian to the extent that the farmers are fewer than ever before. Nigeria, the largest population in Africa, hasn't been food self-sufficient since 1975 or so, and has imported food on a regular basis. Many other African countries are doing the same. And then when one compound the population problems with climate change, which is causing periodic droughts more than ever before, and periodic huge rainfalls. So you're getting cyclones, hurricanes in the east. You're getting low-lying areas in West Africa being submerged, and floods in very strange places that have never experienced floods before. So all these issues are compounding to make Africa more and more difficult for its inhabitants. And the final point, there's much more to say, of course, but the final point on this question for me is that the leaders of Africa are not focusing on this problem. And the only answer to this huge population surge and the crime and other issues which may accompany it, because the population will be youthful, there's no plan of how to create jobs. And jobs are the answer to poverty. Jobs are the answer to the youth bulge. All these countries, 50, 60% of the population is already youthful and will remain so for the next 30 or 40 years. So we have to be aware of these problems that Africa is not perfectly equipped to cope with today. And moving forward, the question and the Malthusian issue is whether African leaders can catch up and begin to focus on the demographic issues. One answer is, of course, better education for girls, because this lowers the fertility rate and that lowers the population increase. As John knows very well, southern Nigeria, very well educated, is basically at replacement rate, about two per woman. In the northern part of Nigeria, much less well educated, you get 6 and 7 children per mother, and that increases the population in an area which is less well educated than in the south. And so I don't see any quick answer, but one thing which could help would be a new American administration redoubling its efforts at assistance for education, assistance for demographic awareness, and through the PEPFAR program started by President Bush to help with contraception in Africa.
With respect to education for girls, the USG already has in place assistance programs, so it would be relatively easy to scale them up. Right. You don't have to invent the wheel with them, and it means that you could move pretty quickly.
Right.
And as you were saying, if you're looking for improvement in the social indices, the fastest way you get it is literacy for women.
Right. Right. And one of the interesting things is that many more Africans are in primary school, and many more than ever before are going to secondary school, but boys finish secondary school and girls do not.
That's right.
Girls drop out for all sorts of reasons, because they have to fetch water for their families.
Yes.
Because they get pregnant, because they're not doing well in school. And very few countries, this is another thing, very few countries have abolished school fees. And as soon as countries abolish school fees, as Kenya did a few years ago, girls stay in school. So abolishing school fees ends up lowering fertility rates.
Indeed. So too does abolishing school uniforms,
Yes. Yeah.
which are a major expense for many Africans.
Right.
And these are all things that you can do. I mean, this is not terribly difficult. And one could imagine a program of the US federal government designed to encourage African countries to abolish school fees.
And to help them do so by giving them small
Exactly.
subventions. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't so long ago that public schools in the United States charged students for books.
Yes.
And
there's still places in the US where there's school uniforms.
indeed, but mostly they're private. So it's a matter of choice.
Right. Right.
Now, the title of your book sounds optimistic. Are you?
It's meant to be optimistic. It's meant to accentuate the fact that Africans are very resilient, but it also builds on three very important new changes in Africa. In the last 20 years, Africans, despite what I said a minute ago, have become much better educated. So the educational levels, even though they're not as good as they should be, Africans are much, much better educated than they ever were. The second point is that the handheld device we all carry, called the cell phone, has transformed Africa's connectedness with the world. The global village is no longer something away from Africa. Africa is now part of the global village. And this means that Africans of all ages, particularly younger Africans, know what they want. They have different aspirations. And that leads to the third point, which is the cell phone leads to consumer aspirations, which then leads Africans to become more and more middle class, not necessarily in our financial terms, but in terms of the African daily wage or daily income. The World Bank says that 1/3 of all sub-Saharan Africans are in the middle class. Another way of looking at it is that there's many more televisions and refrigerators and so on than Africa ever had before. So these aspirations in Africa and these accomplishments, being middle class, means that they have new ways of changing the way in which they're governed and the way in which their leaders behave. And this is pushing Africa, I think, in a more progressive direction. And there's a lot to catch up with, of course, but I'm optimistic because of these major changes in Africa, and they're relatively recent. They're in this century. In the previous century, which is not that long ago, Africans were not connected. Before the cell phone, they were much more isolated. And being a part of the global village and moving around the world, we read about the poor migrants who try to cross from Libya into Europe. But there are many millions of Africans who have come to the United States, went to university, made their homes, and are now sending remittances back to Africa. And in some of the smaller countries, remittances count for 30 to 40% of foreign exchange. So this is again a fourth reason why I'm optimistic about Africa, because they're no longer cut off by pure chance. Yesterday afternoon, I've got a call from a graduate student in California who was doing some research on public relations for an NGO with which I'm connected, and she was all prepared to do research and present some ideas. And I asked about her, and she proudly said she's a double Trojan, meaning a double USC graduate and undergraduate, but she's Nigerian.
Mhm.
And her parents went to university in Tennessee, and her whole family, grandparents and so on, now live in the United States. And so she's become a part of the greater United States, but has ties to Africa and sends remittances to Africa.
Well, two of the things that I particularly valued in your book was the discussion of resilience, which is hard to define, but you really do know it when you see it. And you do see it in Africa. I also particularly appreciated your discussion of middle class and moving the conversation beyond middle class as simply the accumulation of material possessions to rather thinking about middle class as a set of attitudes and aspirations.
Yes, the Pew Foundation produced a study a couple of years back that not only had Africans become more middle class in their numbers, but their attitudes had changed, and they were no longer looking for what we might call popular solutions to rural problems. They were pushing their leaders to focus on solving the problems of democratic governance and so on. And the Pew research showed that this was a major trend as well.
Particularly visible, I think, in Southern Africa, in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia.
Yes, yes, I think one sees it on my most recent visit to that part of the world. Certainly, it's everywhere. Amid great urban poverty, there's also great middle class wealth and enormous aspirations. Particularly, I mean, the interesting thing is that Botswana in 1966 was a basket case, as Henry Kissinger called Bangladesh, and it had a $50 a year was the annual GDP per capita. It's now the third or fourth wealthiest country in Africa, based on diamonds, but also on very good management and a very large middle class now.
But I think that is a really important key, because indeed, Botswana is one of the richest countries in Africa, if not on a per capita basis, the richest. It is true that that wealth is based on diamonds, but the wealth has been managed by the Botswanan government in to my mind, an extremely sophisticated way.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. And Botswana at one point had the highest HIV/AIDS rate in the world, but its answer to that the first government to do so was to roll out free antiretrovirals, making
Yes.
HIV AIDS still prevalent, but a chronic disease as it is in most parts of the world now. Botswana is also the story I like to tell, and that's in the book as well, is that at independence, Botswana had 12 kilometers, that's approximately 7 miles of paved roadway in a country the size of Texas. Okay.
Yeah.
And the Congo, when the Belgians left the Congo, had several thousand miles of paved roadway. And as a result of bad leadership and bad management, we fast forward to today, and the Congo has virtually no, outside of Kinshasa, no paved roadway because it's all potholes. And Botswana has 10,000 or more paved miles of roadway leading to the west coast of Africa across Namibia and leading into South Africa, of course, and across into Zambia. And that's the fundamental reason for that change is, well, two. One is honest leadership and leadership of great integrity and building on the resilience of the Tswana people. But the second part is it's the only country on mainland Africa that has banished corruption almost completely. There are other countries that are coming close, but on the mainland, the difference between Botswana and neighboring South Africa is that South Africa is corrupt still, and Botswana is not.
Now, Botswana also had the advantage of basically being a single ethnic group. So there was an internal kind of cohesion to it.
Yes, I do take that on, John, but Somalia had a cohesive ethnic
It did.
too. And curiously enough, there are 8 Tswana speaking tribes in Botswana, and there are 8 Somali speaking clans in Somalia. And so it's not completely a question of homogeneity. It's a question of leadership.
There's very much a question of leadership. I think there's an interesting phrase that you sometimes hear, and that is the Somalis constitute a nation, but not yet a state.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas in Botswana, it's both.
Well, actually, I say about in the book, and I say almost everywhere, that most African countries are not yet nations because they're 2 things. They're pre-political institutions. That is, they haven't created a political culture of a value system which enables them to go beyond autocratic rule. Whereas Botswana and a few other places have built nations, and the difference, I think, John knows this better than I do, but if you ask someone in London where they're from and they say Nigeria, John will say, well, where are you really from? And they'll say they're from Katsina or they're from
Yes, no, that's right.
Onitsha or wherever. And that goes for most parts of Africa, but no longer Botswana. And the Somali, which is an interesting question, Somali might refer to their clan if pushed hard enough.
Now we willy-nilly have been talking about the quality of African leadership.
Yes.
And certainly there are specific examples of it, of a high order. In addition to Botswana, I'm impressed with the leadership that Cyril Ramaphosa is showing in South Africa. But nevertheless, looking at the continent as a whole, the quality of presidential leadership has not been high. And I find it striking how rarely the Mo Ibrahim Prize is awarded to an African chief of state who leaves office when he's supposed to.
Yeah, there haven't been many awards of the Ibrahim Leadership Prize, exactly for the reason you mentioned, that the leaders haven't done a good job as leaders, and therefore they don't qualify. And then there are others that don't leave office.
That's right. Yeah. Or manipulate the system in some way.
Right. There's an election in Uganda in February. Museveni is now running, I think, for his 5th term as president. And what he did was he had a rule that he himself had put in his constitution saying presidents had to leave at 75. Well, when he turned 75, he amended that law, and he's running post 75. And in Rwanda, which is a well-run place in many respects, President Kagame has abolished term limits, and the guess is that he'll stay until 2034. He's now in his 60s, and he'll continue indefinitely. The same thing has just happened in Guinea on the West Coast,
yes,
where Alpha Conde, who's 82, has just been reelected for his third or fourth term. And there's a man, Paul Biya, in Cameroon, who's been in office almost 40 years, and he spends 80% of his time in Switzerland without even bothering to live in his own country and while he runs it. And so all these are examples of counterfeit leadership. But fortunately, with the middle class pushing, there's more likelihood, I think, in the future of pressure to elect people like Masisi in Botswana and like Ramaphosa in South Africa. South Africa is a very special case, and Ramaphosa is the leader who South Africa desperately needs now after 8 years of Jacob Zuma and 8 years of Thabo Mbeki. Those 16 years really destroyed the Mandela legacy, and it's up to Ramaphosa, and I think he is the man for this season. It's up to Ramaphosa to restore, as Archbishop Tutu says, restore dignity to South Africa and also integrity, which has been lacking in his predecessors.
A kind of footnote to that observation. As somebody who was a career diplomat, I find it puzzling and unfortunate that our formal ties to South Africa are not much stronger than they are. I mean, here you have two multiracial democracies, and yet the official relationship is correct, but not particularly warm.
Yes, not particularly warm, but with respect, the politically appointed ambassadors in Pretoria in recent years have not been particularly distinguished.
No, they have not.
So, and political appointments sometimes are, sometimes aren't, but in this particular case, these were donors to the Trump inauguration, and that didn't get us very far. So under the Biden administration, the great hope is that we can restore relations between South Africa and the US back to the point when Vice President Gore and Vice President Mbeki were in regular contact and had set up a separate tete-a-tete between them on a regular basis. And that meant that the US was more involved in the linchpin of Africa, South Africa. And as you say, that needs to be restored. Um, but also on the Biden administration agenda, of course, is going to be sending the troops that the Trump administration has pulled out of Somalia back into Somalia. We're only talking about 700 men, um, but they're critical in training the 1,000-strong Somali commando force, which is the only force on the ground capable of dealing with the Islamist insurgency, which has been upsetting Somalia and making life very difficult for Somalis since 2006 and 7. And that's one among three critical insurgencies and four critical insurgencies in Africa, and one about which that we've had some agency and reasonable success. And we need to, there's some threat that the Trump administration in its last hours will pull out from bases in Niger, which are now supporting the French attempt to cope with Islamists in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And the British are also helping the French, and there's Dutch and Slovenian troops moving in there now too. And there's a new insurgency in northern Mozambique that is important that the U.S. watches. Because it affects southern Tanzania as well. And all these threats, as in Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, all these threats to stability in Africa make the safety of the US much more tenuous, even though they're far off in Africa. Also undermine the African diaspora living in the US, but also have as in the Congo, have the likelihood of enabling diseases to spread. And those diseases, as we have discovered this year, are not confined geographically. So Africa's very important to us and will remain so.
This, though, is one of those areas where a closer partnership with South Africa could pay real dividends, particularly since Cyril Ramaphosa is clearly interested in an African vocation for South Africa. I think the Biden administration has a particular opportunity to build that relationship. I was serving in Pretoria during the period of the Gore and Becky Commission and actually saw how it operated. And you can do things.
Yes. Yeah, luckily, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State presumptive, knows Africa.
Very well.
He's been there numerous times, and President-elect Biden has been to Africa, I think 6 times. I may be underestimating the number of times he's traveled to Africa. He will not be someone who will call Africans names or call Africans.
No.
He will. One thing we can guarantee, I think, in the new administration is respect for Africa and respect for the rest of the world.
Well, and Linda Thomas Greenfield, the ambassador to the UN designate,
right,
of course, made her career in Africa. She was ambassador to Liberia. She was assistant secretary for Africa. She knows the continent like the back of her hand.
Yes.
And understands the importance of Africa to our own well-being.
Yes, on that point, an obvious thing with that the people we might want to turn to question soon, the people on this Zoom webinar might not appreciate is that there are 54 countries in Africa, and that's a pretty large plurality of the 190 members of the United Nations. That's one thing. And two, as I said at the beginning, it's going to be a fourth of all the people in the world very soon.
Well, and also that's true of the WTO as well. In other words, any international organization which is one country, one vote, the
Right.
Africans are extremely important.
Right.
Shall we turn to questions?
Yes, let's see. I know that there's one hand raised and several in the chat, maybe.
Yes, we do have one. Pardon me, I have a blanket on now because it's a little chilly because the storm's rolling in Massachusetts. So we do have one question right now. It's from Cornelius Johnson. He says, "Is Africa strategically important to the U.S.?"
Okay, is Africa strategically important to the U.S.? Yeah, I think the person asking it was Cornelia Johnson, a she rather than a he. But yes, strategically important. Yes, there are various ways of looking at that. Clearly, we are less interested in buying Africa's oil than we once were. But we're still very interested in getting precious minerals from Africa, particularly those that go into our cell phones, those that go into the nose cones of our fighter aircraft, and those that go into steel making and so on. So there's cadmium and ferrochrome and copper and cobalt in and palladium for our motor cars and platinum, all very important. And they come in large part from Southern Africa, but also from the Congo. Congo is the richest country in the world, perhaps, that hasn't yet realized its riches because of the corruption in the Congo and the chaos in the Congo. So yes, strategically there, and also strategically in terms of the struggle between the US, China, and the US and Russia. China has more embassies than we do in Africa, has more military attaches in Africa than we do, is, despite our great advantage, China is developing its soft power in Africa by training Africans in China, by funding television stations and Confucius institutes throughout Africa. There's 6 countries by my latest count where children are in schools are learning Mandarin as a second language or a third language. And China is absolutely critical to Africa economically, and therefore it has great a diplomatic currency in Africa. The US is still, in terms of foreign assistance, Europe and the US are still greater suppliers of foreign aid, but China gives a great deal has been lending an enormous sums so that Africa can build roads, build dams, build power lines, and modernize its infrastructure. The US can't compete with China in this regard, but strategically, the struggle with China has its Africa connection, and indeed, that's an area that I would expect the Biden administration to pay close attention to in the next several years and well into the future.
The strategic importance of Africa to the United States is, in a sense, a theme that runs right through your book.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, an important theme.
Right. Emma, are there other questions or people want to raise their hands?
Yeah, currently there aren't any questions. We've answered the one question that we've gotten, but if anyone else in the chat has any questions for either of our authors, feel free to leave a question in the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen.
Well, while we're waiting for that, let me just add a word about China. There was a headline, I think, in the New York Times today that Christmas presents in the U.S. will come in inordinate amounts from China this year.
I saw that.
Okay. Now, from an African perspective, that's enormously important. The more China sells to the US, the more China needs primary commodities from Africa.
Yes.
So even though we might want to be buying, American produced goods or something, I always urge my listeners to buy African goods, flip-flops and the lot, because that means that Africa is going to prosper. Without China today, Africa would be unable to sell its oil very readily. It would still sell some, but it wouldn't have the big market that China provides. It would also have more difficulty selling its iron ore. And certainly it wouldn't be able to sell any coal any place in the world were it not for China. So China is the biggest buyer of almost anything one can think of. And the second point, an obvious one, but a second point is when China buys primary products, the prices of those goods stay high. When China is in a slump, as it was last year, and prices fall and Africa suffers. So Africa is more and more dependent on China than it ever was. And even though Europe is still a larger trader with Africa than China, without South Africa, for instance, I was looking at statistics yesterday, the largest market for South Africa's manufactured and primary goods is China. And nobody comes close to that. And so even one of the more advanced economies of Africa depends on China, and the poorest countries in Africa depend much more on China for their infrastructure, for lending. Some African countries are getting into trouble with debt to China, but so far China has been forgiving on those debts. And let me say something which is not exactly accurate, but it gives the point. In a remote village in Nigeria, Zambia, Malawi, or Tanzania, one can find today three things: Coca-Cola, a SIM card to put in your telephone, and a Chinese trader.
And in a great many of those towns, you can also find a Chinese restaurant.
Yes. Our colleague Howard French, a former New York Times reporter, wrote a book a few years ago and said that there were 10 million Chinese citizens permanently in Africa, and there are now probably many, many millions more.
Well, and there's a significant number, certainly of Nigerians, that are living in China.
Yes.
I mean, a significant number. It seems to me, perhaps, I wonder if you would agree, for we in the United States, the issue should not be trying to keep China out of Africa, which some of the rhetoric of the current administration uses, but instead to encourage China to pursue African policies that are responsible and reflect the importance of China's position in Africa?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right, and I think a way of extending that is to find ways which um, the uh, the State Department and the Biden administration might be able to find where we can actually collaborate with China. Now, China's already involved in a minor way in peacekeeping. Um, we can expand on that. There are issues in the health field, particularly if the Chinese vaccine is used in Africa, where
Yes.
we can collaborate with China to our interest and to theirs. And I think there are win-win ways. You're absolutely right. There are win-win ways in which we can not so much compete, but join hands with China in ways which are good for Africa, good for China, good for us.
At least some years ago, when I was still in the department, there were bilateral consultations with the Chinese on Africa twice a year. They alternated between Washington and Beijing. So there was a mechanism in place to explore that type of cooperation.
Good. Well, I hope we can resume that. I mean, there will be so many things on the Blinken agenda that getting to some of them is going to be trying.
The nice thing about that dialogue was it was at the deputy assistant secretary level,
Uh-huh.
not, in other words, at the assistant secretary or above, which meant it would actually happen.
Yes, yes. No, that's absolutely true. The way the bureaucracy of the State Department worked, I understand that. Yes. Um, I wonder, remaining minutes. Oh, are there any
We
other?
have another question. This one is
Okay, go
from
ahead,
Jeff
Amy.
Stillman. He says, which countries/regions are most vulnerable to climate change, and what is being done to address those vulnerabilities?
Very good question, Jeff.
Very.
Um, uh, I I would say that there are several zones of vulnerability. Um, the most vulnerable zone is the area just south of the Sahara, which is called the Sahel. And that's an area which has been prone to periodic drought. And that drought extends from Mauritania across Mali into Ethiopia and Somalia, the Sudan, of course. That's been off and on for centuries, probably. Um, very little is being done to address it at the national level. And but it's what's very interesting is vulnerability because of the climate change that John mentioned at the beginning. The African agriculture is totally dependent on rainfall. And if the rains are too great, it's difficult to plant. And when there's no rain at all, and Southern Africa, of all places, usually plenty of rain, had no rain for several years. And as you remember, Cape Town ran out of water
Yes.
a couple of years back. Now, so that clearly these rainfall patterns are shifting because of climate change. And so what is being done about it in Africa is actually very little. Africans say this is a Chinese American issue, and they're really not a big polluter, therefore they're not really vulnerable. The US recently has pushed back a little and said, yes, but you must try a little harder, and you must curb the pollution from the biggest cement factories in Africa, which are in Nigeria. And you must, curb some of your pollution. That hasn't had much effect yet, but if the U.S. Really throttles back and rejoins the Paris Accord and publishes a program for future cycling down of CO2 emissions, there will be pressure on Africa to join the club, because that's the only way that the US and Europe can help pressure China, is if Africa helps pressure, in its own self-interest, pressure China. Because if we spiral out of control, continue to spiral out of control in the next 10 years, Africa's goose is cooked, climate-wise.
Well, and some Africans now recognize that, even if their governments don't.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's so. And people who suddenly realize they're prone to huge floods in areas that never flooded, or droughts that never happened before, are really in the punishment zone for climate negligence.
Yeah, a spooky statistic is that now 40% of Nigeria's arable land is subject to drought
Yes,
periodically.
yes, and that's that's really extraordinary in so many ways, that Nigeria, which used to chug along very nicely on its agricultural productivity, is now in a very difficult place. Now, the consequence is that of climate change means that people move into cities, so cities get larger and get unlivable.
That's right.
But if I were an African farmer, I wouldn't spend a lot of time farming, because it's not a productive occupation, given the irregularity of rainfall and
Yep.
the cost of fertilizer, and the fact that the roads don't work and there's no electric power, and on and on and on. So one has to be resilient.
But it has to be, and they are resilient. They
Yeah,
are.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. No, one of the striking things over many years in Africa, touring rural areas, was to see how resilient populations were, and how able to cope with things that we would never begin to cope with, and Africans can do that. The vision I want to leave some of you with is a um, person hops on the back of his bike, puts a big bundle on his head and on the back of his bike, and cycles off. And John and I know that he's going to cycle for 30 miles with that
yes.
package, and then deliver his goods or whatever he's carrying, and come back the same way later in the night.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's resilience in many ways. That's perseverance, and that's coping with what one has to cope with. Is life is not as easy there as it is here.
Well, I hope our audience will buy the book. The book is fascinating. It's a great read. It really is a great read. And willy-nilly, depending on how much you know about Africa, you're going to end up knowing a great deal more when you have finished the book, as well as at having a really good time.
Thank you, John. And read John's book as well, because you can't escape knowing about Nigeria if you read John's book. And Nigeria is so critical to Africa. As John says, it's a fifth of the continent, and a major player in everything that Africa does in the future.
If you guys have time, we do have 2 more questions.
Oh, good. All right. Okay. John and I were just filling in the time.
Yeah, of course. So from Latau Lu, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We have, what areas can China and the US cooperate in prompting Africa's progress?
Okay. China and Africa can cooperate in assisting Africa in dealing with Islamist insurgency, in peacekeeping, in and in probably the best way, and the way that would their talents would be, our talent and China's talents would be complementary, would be in the medical and health areas.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, uh, the coronavirus it has been quite heavy, not as heavy as we expected, but quite heavy in Africa. And there's much to be done there. There's much to be done in malaria reduction. There's much, I mean, China, after all, has barefoot doctors and has experience in public health. There are Chinese doctors in some countries. Very much more could be done, and the U.S. Could actually assist in bringing Chinese health workers into contact with countries like Malawi, which has one physician now for every 52,000 people. It could bring China into that area. I think another area which might not be immediately thought of is China's building dams, and President Obama's administration had a electricity generation plan to extend it in Africa. That's in areas where U.S. expertise, Chinese expertise could work well together. And also, now that China is the largest solar producer in the world, that's a coming thing in Africa. And China and the US could both develop solar farms in a number of places in Africa. I could go on in the energy area because uh, there's ways in which we're getting energy out of Lake Kivu, and there are wind farms in a few places in Africa. So there's lots in the energy area where we could cooperate together.
Awesome. And our last question is, do you have any current updates on the Ethiopian
Tigray.
Tigrayan conflict? I was almost going to say Tigerian. I was like, that's not right.
Well, this is one of the great tragedies of Africa, one of the great tragedies with a Nobel Peace Prize laureate um, trying to not so much to keep Ethiopia together, but to keep his rule in Africa. This is Abiy Ahmed, to keep his rule in Africa strong and cohesive. When the Tigrayans, the Tigrayans ousted a Marxist autocracy in 1991. And then from 1991 until 2018, the Tigrayans actually ran Ethiopia. They're only 6% of the population, but they were the guerrilla fighters who won the war, and they ruled Ethiopia in a centralized fashion with a Tigrayan called Meles Zenawi, who was really a talented and well-spoken visionary leader. His successors were not necessarily Tigrayan, but Tigrayans were still running the country. They turned to Abe in 2018 because he was an Oromo. The Oromo are the largest populace in Ethiopia, and they turned to him because of Oromo protests. So he took over, and what he began to do, which is the cause of the current war, what he began to do in 2018 and until today is to push the Tigrayans out of positions of power. He marginalized them increasingly in the capital, Addis Ababa, and reduced their importance in many sectors of the country where they were prominent. And then in October, when the Tigrayans decided to hold a regional election for a local regional parliament when he didn't want them to, that helped precipitate his determination to put the Tigrayans in their place. And so the great tragedy is that he has succeeded for the moment in wiping out resistance in Tigray, but 50,000 or more Tigrayans have crossed the local border with the Sudan, and thousands have been killed. We don't know how many because internet access has been cut off. And there's still warfare going on. And my fear is that there will be a low-level civil war for many years in this otherwise prosperous and lovely part of northern Ethiopia. I was there a few years back, and I'm glad I was there before it was destroyed. And I think it's a great tragedy that a Democrat has become an autocrat and put down what was an incipient minor rebellion in one of the provinces, and did so forcibly, and now has cemented his power, but I'm not quite sure how firmly the crown of Ethiopia will rest on his head in future.
That's all we have for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone who has joined us. Buy John's book, buy my own, and live happily ever after.
Exactly. And you will live happily ever after.
We will get through this. Thank you all so much for coming. You can support both John and Robert. You can also support the bookstore by ordering through us, should you decide to, at belmontbooks.com. But thank you all so much for taking the time to come and chat with us and come and listen to this fascinating talk.
And thank you for having us.
Of course. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.